Ascultați Algoritmi și adicție, un podcast despre fenomenul jocurilor de noroc în România. Suntem Raluca Durbacă
și Mădălina Muscă,
iar astăzi discutăm în limba engleză despre politici publice de reglementare a industriei jocurilor de noroc și despre conceptul de joc responsabil cu profesorul Charles Livingstone de la Monash University din Melbourne, Australia. In this episode, we will discuss the mantra of responsible gambling. We will explore the ties between gambling companies and politics, the gambling harms that often remain hidden, what a genuine prevention and treatment infrastructure should look like, and much more. We will go more in depth with the case of Australia, a country often described as having the world's highest per capita gambling losses, and then open the conversation to broader international lessons. Today's guest is Professor Charles Livingstone from Monash University in Melbourne, one of the leading global experts in gambling studies. He has written extensively on gambling regulation, the commercial determinants of health, and the political strategies of the gambling industry. He is also a co-author of the Lancet Public Health Commission on Gambling report, which called for reframing gambling as a global public health challenge. His latest article, The End of Responsible Gambling, shows how the industry's favorite slogan serves as a shield that deflects accountability and blames individuals rather than harmful products and policies.
Professor Livingstone, thank you for accepting our invitation. We are delighted for this opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you.
First of all, we know that you have been studying gambling for many years, and your work together with other scholars has shaped the way we think about it as a public health issue. Could you tell us how you first became interested in this field and how gambling research has evolved since you began?
Yeah, so Australia is not unlike other parts of the world where gambling gets a toehold, and it was uncommon to have gambling establishments in most Australian states until the early 1990s. And then there was, a particular economic problem in Australia. The state governments were short of money to do the things they needed to do. So gambling appeared to provide a form of taxation revenue which was painless from the point of view of governments anyway. And we started to notice that there was a proliferation of gambling venues, and mostly these were EGM venues, gaming machine venues, and mostly they were located in areas of the greatest disadvantage. And in the early days, the government weren't providing data on where these machines were located and how much money they were making and so on. So together with colleagues, we started an exercise in counting where they were and relating that to the socio-demographic characteristics of those areas, and discovered quite quickly that it was in fact the case that they were targeting the most disadvantaged people. So we discovered pretty soon also that these were the places that made most money. And eventually we managed to get some concessions from government that stopped the growth of the machines, revealed where they were and how much money they were making, and gave us some much better access to data that helped us start talking more productively, I guess, about what interventions were needed. I mean, it's been a long struggle because these are very influential forces. The people that operate these devices are generally very well connected politically. We are talking about huge amounts of money. In Australia, gambling expenditure, that is what people lose gambling, is north of 33 billion Australian dollars a year, which means that we are losing something like $1,500 US per person per year. And given that most people don't actually gamble, apart from the odd lottery ticket, it means that the people that are gambling are spending huge amounts of money. And since they're concentrated in areas of disadvantage, all it's doing is entrenching that disadvantage and causing enormous harm. So that's what got me into it, discovering that was the case. And I've been trying to get to the bottom of it ever since.
Very interesting. It seems like we are more or less at the beginning of this process in Romania. Could you tell us how the gambling research has evolved since you began? You said that, first of all, you asked for data from the industry, and then I imagine things got a bit more complicated.
Yeah, things always get complicated. I mean, there has been a long body of research into gambling in Australia and elsewhere around the world, particularly in the US. But that has been pretty much focused on this so-called responsible gambling approach. And that is, essentially, it argues that gambling is just another economic activity like everything else, that it relies heavily on the neoliberal doctrine that people should be free to spend the money that they have however they wish, and that the principle of consumer sovereignty, that is, that people spend money on the things that give them the most utility, the old economic jargon. But of course, that doesn't account for addiction. It doesn't account for people that become heavily addicted to a particular product and will consume it to detriment of every other activity in their life. And gambling is particularly addictive. It's as addictive as any narcotic or as alcohol or any other substance you care to name. And because, in places like Australia and increasingly around the world, it is everywhere. It's ubiquitous. It is hard to escape. It's one thing to say that someone who has a heroin habit is a serious addict, but, the government isn't standing on every street corner selling it. Whereas in Australia and other countries now, what we've got is government license. I don't know what the licensing system is in Romania, but in Australia, the government was licensing these products for people to consume at great expense in disadvantaged suburbs. So the old guard, I guess, of gambling research documented it as a form of personal responsibility. So if you got into trouble, it was all your fault because you couldn't exercise constraint. But I think since certainly in the last 15 years, there's been a growing understanding in the gambling research field that gambling is not an ordinary commodity. It's an addictive product like alcohol, like drugs, and it needs to be regulated like one. So that doesn't necessarily mean that you stop people gambling, but it does mean that it has to be regulated adequately. It has to provide people with tools to manage their gambling so it doesn't get out of control in the first place, and provide them with a way of not gambling if they choose not to, that is foolproof. And, the problem is none of those things are in place in most of the countries and jurisdictions around the world where gambling is legal. So what we've got is essentially a business which makes most of its money from the most addicted people, and which imposes enormous harm generally on the most disadvantaged communities. So the recognition of that took some time to come in the gambling research field. I think the old guard is still alive and well, particularly in the United States and in Australia and in some cases Europe and Britain. But for the most part, more recent research has demonstrated that the responsible gambling mantra is ineffective, it doesn't work, and the only thing it does is provide a smokescreen for the gambling industry to continue business as usual.
Yes, we'll go a bit more in depth related to this responsible gambling mantra. Now I would like to talk a bit about critical gambling studies. We in Romania, we don't have a tradition of researching the subject of gambling. There are some scattered initiatives like our project, but internationally, gambling has become the subject of sustained academic inquiry with networks, dedicated journals, and many collectives or big collectives that are studying this and producing things like the report of the Lancet Public Health Commission. You are now part of the group of scholars that initiated the Journal of Critical Gambling Studies. Can you tell us what is critical gambling studies and how does it differ from the traditional approach to gambling research?
Sure. So, the traditional approach to gambling research has been one of mostly empirical measurement of how much people gamble, where they gamble, and it's been heavily influenced by the psychological or the sciences. So it's been focused on, I guess, what you could say as individual abnormalities. Okay, so it's got its home traditionally in abnormal psychology. It's seen as a psychiatric or psychological condition that people suffer from and from which they should be cured. So that medicalisation has been quite pernicious because, once again, it enables the industry to get off the hook. So an industry which is providing highly addictive products simply blames individuals because of their personal characteristics. So traditionally, that was the way the gambling studies was done. A lot of us have come to the view that there are many more causes of harmful gambling than individual failings. And these include the environment in which it occurs, the ability to operate, which is provided by, so-called regulatory systems, the lack of interest by government in stopping harm because they can't see it often or they don't appreciate it, the invisibility of harm because many of the people who have been harmed and their families experience significant stigma and shame as a consequence of this, which is seen as a very bad habit, and because of this sort of abnormal psychological view, seen as something like a failure of the will, a personal problem that people don't want to provide coverage of. So once you start looking at the sociological causes of it, the link to disadvantage, the way in which the devices themselves and gambling products are designed carefully to provide sort of psychological conditioning that is, the pathway to addiction. And once you start looking at that, it's hard not to sort of think that there was a real need for a much more critical approach. And I think when we talk about critical gambling studies, what we're talking about is not just moving away from a focus on individual responsibility, although that's an important part of it. It's to utilise as many disciplines as we can to understand the terrain, to understand the architecture of gambling, why it has grown so fast and continues to grow very rapidly, how it's regulated, or more importantly, not regulated, how individuals can become trapped in a cycle of addiction, and in particular, what we need to do about it. So the critical part, I think you'd say we define critical studies as being the ability to look at a situation and work out what's going wrong, and particularly where it's a legal product, which it is in so many jurisdictions now. And so you've got to look at the situation in which this gambling is presented as a legal product, and you have to analyse what is causing the problem. And the problem is, of course, people getting addicted and suffering enormous harm and imposing that on others as well, and then work out what to do to fix it. So the critical part of it is the ability to understand what's wrong and then to respond with an approach which argues for interventions that can prevent or minimise harm. So prevention has never been big on the traditional gambling research agenda. Some mitigation of harms has been encouraged from time to time, or harm minimisation measures, but most of those are ineffective because they follow the old dogma, and they are half-heartedly enforced, if at all. So, those of us who are interested in the critical idea are interested in proposing interventions which have some success. And we've seen that now with, the Nordic countries in particular have been very good at intervening to prevent gambling harm. And their example is a really important one. But most of the rest of the world hasn't gone to that stage yet, and they're still concerned about essentially individualistic traits, and they're not very good at prevention at all.
From your perspective, can we define and how can we measure the social costs of gambling?
Well, we can. And colleagues have developed in Australia, have developed a relatively novel method to do that. And they do it by applying public health principles about the burden of disease and the costs associated with particular disability costs. Okay, so if you think about how we measure the relative impact of a disease or a series of diseases on society, then you do it via burden of disease model. So you allocate the cost of, lung cancer, the costs of any disease you like, smoking, etc. Relate that to lung cancer. So what that does is it gives you a pretty good idea of the relative importance that a particular risk factor has in the context of the burden of disease. So you can also allocate a monetary value to that. So my colleagues have estimated that the social cost of gambling in Victoria alone is $14 billion a year, which is more than people actually spend on gambling in Victoria. So it's imposing harm on the community, which is worth more than the amount of money that passes through the gambling businesses. Now, to put that in perspective, it means that it is about 2/3 of the value of harmful alcohol consumption and much, much, much greater than illicit drug consumption by a factor of about 5, if not more. So what we're looking at is something most people would agree that harmful alcohol use is a major drain on society, but gambling is up there and it's 2/3 of the value. And that's not necessarily measuring all the costs because so many of the consequences are not readily measured, so you're relying on estimates. So the costs of gambling will include such things as obviously mental health problems. If many of the gambling industry say that, the mental health is a confounding factor because people who have mental health problems will use gambling to self-medicate, and that's true. But it's also true to say that if you're self-medicating with gambling, it's not going to make you any better. In fact, it's almost certainly going to make your situation much worse. And so that's an additional burden imposed on people who are already experiencing a significant burden. The second part of it, of course, is harms to one's physical health. And there's now increasing evidence that gambling is linked to cardiovascular health, including increased risk of heart disease and increased risk of stroke. It's also been obviously strongly linked to obesity and to the sequelae of obesity, such as diabetes and so on. That's the harms to the individual. Obviously, that includes loss of assets, loss of revenue. Their own individual income often goes straight into the gambling devices. If you're an individual person, that may not be such a big deal, but if you have a family, that can be a very big deal. So you lose your assets, you lose your income. You often end up doing things that you wouldn't normally do, such as illegal activities to generate revenue. And that can, of course, lead to interaction with the justice system and in some cases, imprisonment. It's very common for people in Victoria and Australia generally to be convicted of crimes, particularly white-collar crimes, because of their gambling habits. So they will swindle money from their employer. They'll get away with it for a while. They keep gambling with it and they end up owing hundreds of thousands of dollars that they have no hope of ever repaying. And then they end up getting caught and then going to jail. So that's quite common. The other, I guess you could say, aspect of it is the impact that it has on the broader society. So all of this costs a lot of money. I mean, people that are going through the justice system are imposing significant costs on the courts, on the police, on the prison system, and so on. And those costs are greater than they would be if we didn't have such widespread gambling. And that doesn't even mention the impact that it has on families. So you're seeing divorce and separation are major consequences of gambling harm, neglect of children. The transmission of poverty from one generation to the next is not uncommon because, someone may have worked for a long time, then got a gambling habit and they lose all their assets. It's not uncommon for people to lose their home, to lose any savings they might have had, and to end up essentially destitute. There is also, of course, the neglect of children because you're not there, you're out gambling or you're spending all your time and energy on gambling, not to mention your money. And so, the dissolution of families has a huge impact on children, and it's one which in many cases could have been avoided. We also know that there are very strong links between gambling and intimate partner or domestic violence. So in areas where there is, a concentration of poker machines, the rate of family violence reported to the police is about 30% higher than in areas without this concentration of poker machines, slot machines. This also imposes costs, of course, on the family members who are often losing not just the assets of the partner, but their own assets. Often people don't realise what's been going on until, they discover one day that what they thought was in the bank account isn't there anymore and they haven't got any money to buy food for the kids with, and they've lost their house at the same time. So, the effects on marriages and family relationships are very brutal. We also know from a study a couple of years ago in New South Wales that there is a direct relationship between the level of gambling expenditure in a local government area and the rate of crime in that area. And that's just not white-collar crime, it's the rate of all forms of crime, including assaults against people. That includes domestic violence, but it extends beyond that. Thieving from cars, stealing cars, all forms of money-making crime, if you like. It's quite staggering that there is this direct relationship. It's quite clear. It comes from official government data. Nothing has changed, of course, as a consequence of this, but it's a truth. And everywhere we look, we see evidence of the harms associated with gambling. And a recent study in Victoria, again, using the coroner's data, the data from the coroner's system, found that 4.2% of suicides in Victoria over a 7-year period were connected to gambling. And that was almost absolutely a definite undervaluation and underestimate of how much. I mean, the researchers would probably double that on a reasonable estimate. So, massive range of harm associated with this activity. It's exactly as you would expect it to be if you wanted to think about it for a second. But no one wants to think about it for very long because it is, as you say, a money-making venture, which makes a lot of people very rich, and it makes governments, it makes the task of raising revenue that much easier. And on the point of revenue raising, I would point out that it's very regressive. So whereas most income tax systems tax higher income earners more than lower income earners, this disproportionately taxes low income earners because they're the people who gamble for the reasons that I mentioned earlier.
I've seen a recent study that was talking about suicidal thoughts in gambling addicts, which were like 25% of the addicts were having like self-harm thoughts, or they thought about suicide. I think there's not enough data on this, but it's shocking to see the numbers from the very few studies that have come out. Is there a state-sponsored treatment infrastructure in Australia? Because in Romania, there is not. I mean, there is this service or department, let's call it, of the national organization that regulates the gambling industry. They started gathering money there, and they're supposed to use it for some sort of prevention or treatment, but nothing has been done so far, and it's very hard to get treatment if you're a gambling addict in Romania. How does it look in Australia?
So a proportion of the money that is paid in tax revenue is allocated towards treatment and research and prevention. And the state governments run it. They run a sort of national helpline service, and they have some counselling services provided. That's fine, and people need it. But the problem is that only about 1 in 10 of the people who might benefit from it actually get access to it. And that's largely because, as I think I mentioned earlier, shame and stigma are a key part of the way the industry talks about it. So they blame the individual, and of course the individual accept that. It's pretty common sense, quote unquote, way of thinking about it. And so they become very shameful and very stigmatized. So most people don't even go and get help, even though it might help them. What it means is that the gambling help services are very undersubscribed and probably massively underfunded because they don't have a budget to actually market their services and to oppose the stigmatisation and shaming processes that the industry is very good at putting out there.
So a part of the stigma that you are talking about is also coming from this mantra that we were mentioning about responsible gambling. And we see this narrative also in the Romanian context. We have this slogan that is you can see everywhere, in every betting shop, but also in the EGMs. It's in Romanian we call it joacă responsabil, which means play responsibly, which is already implying playing, but responsibly. It's your fault if you are not responsible. Why is this discourse so attractive for policymakers and for politicians and for the industry? And how you could explain the dangers of this mantra?
There's an old saying that for every complex problem, there's a simple, straightforward solution, and it's wrong. And this is a classic case of that. If you look at someone who has a gambling issue, you think, well, they're weak-willed. They should, it's a common sense view. It's something that people who have no experience of addiction or no experience particularly of gambling addiction think is just a bit of a failing, a personal failing. And they think based on the sort of studies that industry supports, prevalent studies, they think, it's only 1% of the population. And the industry always says, well, that's only 1% of the people that gamble, so who cares about them? That's nothing. And now, of course, most people don't gamble, and the ones who gamble on slot machines are very much in the minority, but the population prevalence is still 1% or more. And what it means is that the people who do gamble experiencing gambling harm at a much greater rate than that, often 5 or 6%. If you walk into a late night gambling venue in Australia, you can be certain that almost everyone in the gambling room is addicted. Particularly after midnight, when many of them are still open, most of them are still open. Everybody in the gambling room is addicted, and they're all betting a huge amount of money. So anyway, it's a common sense approach to a complex problem, and it doesn't interrogate anything to do about the product itself. Whereas we understand that alcohol has addictive properties, whereas we understand that illicit drugs are highly addictive, not many politicians, not many ordinary people have any comprehension of how addictive gambling is. And I think that's because they look at the machine and think, what a stupid thing. And I push the buttons a few times and I just don't get anything out of it. But of course, what they don't understand is that if you push them more than a few times, especially if you're feeling the weight of the world, if you live in an area of disadvantage, you don't have enough money, you can't pay the rent on time, etc., then what you discover is that you get this sense of relief from your problems by gambling. When we think about gambling, most of us don't understand that what's happening is we're experiencing a form of conditioning. So we've got classical conditioning, which is a bit like, Anton Pavlov, who had the dog famously, who would salivate when he rang a bell, but fed it at the same time. And eventually the dog would salivate, even though he didn't give it any food. All he had to do was ring the bell. So that's classical conditioning. And then we have the principle of operant conditioning, which was discovered by Skinner and his colleagues in the 1950s. And that's a little bit more complex, but what it basically says is that if you provide an unpredictable pattern of reinforcement, that is, you give a subject a reward intermittently, that will habituate them to keeping on doing whatever it is that provides the reward. Now, if you look at a slot machine, if you count the anticipation, the occasional win, what we call losses disguised as wins, and near misses, and all those other events that the machine can generate, then whereas, in our natural state, if I can put it that way, we might get an operant conditioning response maybe once or twice a day if we're lucky. In a poker machine or a slot machine, we get it every 2 or 3 seconds, depending on how fast the machine operates. So what that does is it generates a flow of dopamine in particular, but also other neurochemicals that are very enjoyable. They give you a sense of accomplishment, of reward, of feeling good. And if you're in the situation where you don't feel very good about your life, this is a blessed interval of relief. And while you're doing it, and this is what people have told me time and time and time again, when you're doing it, you don't think of anything else. All of your problems evaporate and disappear. I think you can imagine that's a very addictive experience. And you do it all without having to take any drugs or any other substances. You just sit in front of a machine and push the buttons, and you end up getting this constant stream of rewards, which you don't even understand. And so, of course, a machine combines, as does online gambling now, of course, combines those basic principles. You get the operant conditioning reinforcement schedule, which is well tuned, and you get the classical conditioning from the bells and whistles and the images and so on. And those combine to produce a really constant dopamine flow, which you're not going to get anywhere else in life, particularly if you're coming from a disadvantaged background. So, most people don't get a sense of that at all. They don't understand it because they've never done it and they don't experience it. So especially politicians and people like that, who are regulators and bureaucrats, they have no conception of that. The industry bends over backwards to make sure that they never understand that. And it's much easier just to blame individuals and to give them, a few little bits and pieces of a counselling service here and there, and put on, ads and tell people to behave themselves, rather than to actually address the issue, which is dangerous products that are not well regulated.
Yes, indeed. And all this in a context of very neoliberal governments in general that try to push responsibility from the collective, from the state, towards the personal responsibility. How can we shift this narrative? How can we talk about harmful products and policies? Is there a solution or models that you have seen or researched that could work better in our societies?
Well, there's certainly models that could work better. Not much could be worse. The real issue here is getting people to understand that this is a serious addiction which has real world consequences, not just for gamblers, but in fact, there's probably more consequences for those affected by gambling than for the gambler themselves. You know, if you factor in their family, their friends, their employer from whom they steal time and money, the society generally, etc. So the consequences are extreme, and they're not well described because the industry is very happy for it not to be well described. In many countries, we're starting to get a better sense of it, and this is starting to have some effects. One of the key, I guess you could say, examples of getting some progress has been in the UK, where there's a charity called Gambling with Lives. I don't know if you've come across them, but that was founded by a couple whose young son, I think he was in his 20s, suicided because of his gambling addiction. That happens a lot. That happens all the time. And in Australia, we're starting to get more and more coverage of this because of the work focused on links between gambling and suicide. And that's really important to actually probe these types of relationships, which we're not really well explored, but they can be with a little bit of imagination. But anyway, in the UK, this group had a lot of success. One of the reasons for it, of course, was that the two people whose son died in the first instance with this group were very, I guess you could say, very respectable middle-class British people. They were the sort of people that you always see on the BBC, if you know what I mean. And they're very articulate, and they were very well equipped to bring their fight to the industry. Very hard to attack a nice middle-class couple whose child has suicided, clearly because of their gambling problem. Now, the industry would normally dismiss it as, you know, they're just an unfortunate side effect. But they were persistent, and they've managed to gather quite a substantial group now of people who are in a similar position to themselves, people whose children have died because of a gambling addiction. And of course, that's the sort of thing that's hard for governments to ignore. It's a very difficult issue that government simply can't ignore, particularly when it gets good media coverage. And this couple were able to do that. So apart from the personal circumstances of this couple, what made a difference and is making a difference was the fact that they had clear evidence of the links between gambling and the death of their son. And that has continued to grow. So what I'm saying is when we get clear evidence of the links between a particular adverse consequence and gambling, then it starts to build a much stronger case for better regulation and more effective interventions. And, you know, I won't say that everything in Britain is great, in fact, far from it, but it has forced the Gambling Commission to undertake a series of reforms and to take their responsibilities that much more seriously. And as I said, you know, the focus on the links between gambling and suicide in Australia have started to be revealed. That has generated a lot of press, and it's also generated a lot of calls, even from within political parties, for substantial reform, although that hasn't yet occurred, mainly because the industry remains very powerful, is very well connected, has a lot of money, and it uses it very wisely to buy political influence, as I'm sure you're aware. I think there is hope, and we certainly know what to do. I mean, the biggest and likeliest, most successful intervention will be to impose a system where if you want to gamble, you can, but you have to run it through an account. The account has to be linked to your own bank account, a legitimate bank account. And when you have set the limit, you have to stick to it. Now, some people will of course, set ridiculous limits. In some countries, they set statutory limits, as in Norway, and I think in Finland. In other countries, they just let you set your own limit. But my experience of talking to gamblers is that many of them wish that that system was in place before they got into trouble, because they would have used it, they tell us, if it was compulsory. Where it's voluntary, no one uses it because no one likes to think of themselves as a problem gambler. But where it's required, people actually do set limits that are sensible and are within their means. Once they start realising how much they're spending on gambling, that itself is a bit of a wake-up call, because once you set a limit and you're regularly exceeding it, then it's clear that it's got hold of you and that you're getting in a bit of trouble. So that's a really effective intervention, and I think there are various forms of limit setting in 27 European countries now, and they have, by and large, been very effective, and they have helped people control their gambling because, as you know, when you may have the best intentions in the world, but when you're sitting in front of the machine and it's doing its tricks, then you lose your executive function, as they call it. Your ability to make rational decisions goes out the window. And people end up just spending everything they've got because they enjoy the sensation so much they don't want it to stop. That's the first one. And of course, one of the other effective interventions is the abolition of advertising, banning and prohibiting advertising on both the old-fashioned media and particularly on social media, prohibiting influencers from promoting gambling. And a number of countries have done that in recent times. In the Netherlands, a famous soccer player was fined substantial amounts, I think in the tens of thousands of euros, for promoting a gambling site recently. And that's because they've decided that influencers are having an adverse effect, particularly on young people, because, you know, especially sporting heroes are very much looked up to by young men in particular. So, you know, what you've got is I guess you could say, a system which constantly reinforces how, you know, normal gambling is. And that's with advertising, with the marketing, with the association with sport. If you're able to stop that, then you engage in what's called denormalisation. And that was a very effective part of the whole campaign against tobacco in those countries where that's been successful. So you've got interventions such as pre-commitment, denormalisation, which includes prohibiting advertising and marketing, and, importantly, associations with sport. And you've also got to have effective penalties for gambling operators that breach the rules. And these aren't just fines. I don't care about fines. Fines are nothing. They have, you know, literally hundreds of millions of euros or dollars at their disposal. So even very strict fines are not going to stop them doing what they're doing. Losing their license for a period of time or permanently would. And it's a sort of penalty that would make them adhere to the rules. And I think the final part of that, you know, my 4-point plan is to get rid of any mention of responsible gambling from regulatory systems. The responsibility for harmful gambling rests with the providers of gambling, much more than it rests with individuals who are suckered into an addictive product.
You've mentioned the close connection, and you've also researched and written about this, the close connections between politicians and the industry, which I would dare say manipulates policy through donations and lobbying. And this, we can see this happening in Romania also. Every political initiative on banning advertising, introducing more regulation of the industry has failed in Parliament. And it seems a bit hopeless. I mean, any political initiative just dies very quickly. They have such a powerful lobby that even higher taxation has been, they've tried to tax them higher this year because of austerity measures, and the industry lobbied it, and instead of a 5% tax, it went down to a 3% tax. So it seems like you cannot push it in any direction. And you were talking about like blockers or like this type of we have here in Romania, they're trying to implement a self-exclusion mechanism in which you have to go and join this database, and they should exclude you, bar you from entering casinos and slot machine places. That doesn't work because it's not been implemented yet. So it seems like there is no hope. This is how I would describe it.
Well, there is hope. I mean, I wouldn't give up. I mean, the only thing about self-exclusion is people who want to self-exclude generally end up there because they've got nothing left. Okay, so it's not a preventive measure. At best, it ameliorates the situation of people who have already lost everything. And the reason it doesn't work is because the industry doesn't want it to work. But if you had an account-based gambling card system, such as they do in Norway, then if you don't want to gamble, then you either put a zero limit on your monthly gambling allowance, or you simply don't get a card, you hand it in. So, you know, the account-based system is the answer to several of those types of problems. But if we go to look at the issue with politicians, it's the same issue that politicians are the cause of, for most of the harmful industries that cause problems in our world. I don't know what it's like in Romania, but in Australia, the harmful industries, alcohol, tobacco, processed foods, mining companies, energy companies, they are very close to politicians. And they're not just close to them because they give them donations, although that helps. And they're not just close to them because they can provide them with, amenity, but because they are constantly with them. There was a story in one of the news outlets today in Australia about there's a thing called the Parliamentary Sports Club, which organises events for politicians so they can go out and play cricket or football or whatever with each other. But one of the sponsors of this, of course, is the peak body for the wagering operators in Australia. And they deny that they're peddling influence. They say they're just there to provide support for the politicians having a relaxing time away from the office. But of course, while they're doing that, they're right there with them. And one of my colleagues, Peter Adams from New Zealand, has written a lot about this. And he says it's a sort of grooming space. So if you give a politician a free ticket to a big football match, for example, in your exclusive box high in the stand, then you've got them for 2 hours of whining and dining, and you're right in their ear. And what it means is you become, whether consciously or otherwise, you become a buddy, you become their best friend. You know who they are. And I don't know what Romanian politicians are like, but Australian politicians always tend to like people who are nice to them, because so many people are not. I mean, even the Prime Minister of Australia, in the debate around banning advertising, particularly around sporting matches of gambling, he was taking his advice from a fellow who was the head of the National Rugby League, which is one of the big sports on which gambling is very common, and also of the racing organisation, horse racing organisation in New South Wales. So he was taking advice and facts that he used then in public discourse from this fellow, because he was his mate, as we say in Australia. And his mate couldn't possibly tell him something that was untrue. So, it's not just that they give them money and thus get access to them. They do that. They also employ them after they've left politics, so they get a nice cushy job, and they wine and dine them at these sorts of events that I was talking about, and they become their friends. And that's where they look to for advice. So it's hardly likely that they're going to do anything that's going to upset their buddies. Now, you might say that's a bit simplistic, but I think there's pretty good evidence that is in fact what's happening. And until we introduce systems where those donations and access is no longer possible, then it's not going to change.
You've mentioned big tobacco, and maybe you've also researched and you've compared the tactics that the big tobacco industry has used with the gambling industry. Maybe you can highlight a bit some of the tactics that they've
Sure. The tobacco industry invented what we now call the corporate playbook, and that is a series of practices that they use to advance their interests with politicians in particular. Now, a subset of that is corporate political activity. So that includes the donations, forming relationships with politicians, providing them with sort of evidence which they've concocted themselves. And that was very effective with tobacco for a long time. They also, of course, point to the revenue that they provide to governments, and that's always a very persuasive argument for most of them. But underneath that, they also run, they used to do things called astroturfing. Astroturfing is where you set up a fake grassroots organisation that is protesting about increased regulation of tobacco or whatever. And the tobacco industry used to do that with great frequency. So, for example, in Australia some years back, they set up an organisation that purported to represent corner stores, little shops that sell after hours, groceries and so on, but which were also tobacconists and sold a lot of tobacco. So this organisation was trying to get traction in the media with its message, which was that new regulations were killing the corner store, this great institution. But that was revealed quite quickly as an astroturfing exercise. But that has been successful on many occasions in the past. In America, they bankrolled an outfit called Physicians for Tobacco, which argued that in the earlier days that there wasn't evidence linking tobacco with cancer, etc., so we should just let people do what they wanted to do. And in any event, it was a matter of personal responsibility just to, hammer home that particular message. So this sort of fake grassroots organisations has been part of it. And I think it's happened a bit in Australia. You get, people protesting about regulation and how hard it is to put on a bet, but who are not particularly genuine in their interest. The other thing they've been very good at is recruiting scientists. Tobacco did that very effectively for a long period of time. They recruited scientists with generous research grants, provided they were addressing an issue that the tobacco industry was in favour of. So debunking existing research that linked cancer to tobacco consumption was a particular favourite of theirs. And, at one point they were funding a very large number of scientists with a large amount of money to prove that cancers were caused by genetic abnormalities, not by smoking. Now, of course, this was complete nonsense, but it was done by people who had positions at universities. They were scientists. They purportedly knew what they were doing. The results didn't really stand up to good scrutiny, but it doesn't matter because the people who are the subject of this message are politicians. They don't understand science. They certainly don't understand statistics. And I suspect they don't understand genetics. So, it was a sort of argument that can be very persuasive with the right audience. And in the meantime, of course, legitimate scientists are going crazy with indignation about this. But there's not a lot you can do because you don't get to see politicians the same way the tobacco industry does because of their donations and all the rest of it, okay? So that was another tactic and a very successful one. And that, of course, has been used by the gambling industry repeatedly.
I wanted to ask you as a final, ending our podcast, looking at this, let's say we can compare it with the saprophytic mushroom, this industry. Do you think, is there any way to cut the spread of this mushroom? Is there any hope that we can have in this context where more and more food is provided to this mushroom in order to get bigger?
That's an interesting analogy. I think we can, but it requires quite a lot of collective effort, I think. And that's happening. I mean, in Australia now, there's a widespread support for reform. There's no doubt about that. 75% of people think gambling advertising is abhorrent and they want it gone. And that's particularly the case of people with kids. Because, you sit down on Friday night to watch the big football game and you are bombarded with advertising for gambling, and you with your young children who are absorbing it along with their favourite sports heroes and so on. And it's clearly causing them to start looking at their favourite games very differently. And, ordinary people understand that. The problem is there are so many other issues in the world that people don't put it as a priority. But I think it is starting to gain traction and the mood for reform is growing. It's growing at all levels in society, including at parliamentary level. I guess our problem is we're dominated by two political parties who both have been bought off by these interests. But that two-party system is breaking down anyway. I don't think it depends on breaking down the two-party system in any event. I think what it means is that we need reform of a number of systems, which is not beyond possibility. We need the public to make sure that it is something that they care about. And that's happening because so many people now know someone who's had a problem with gambling, or it's someone in their own family or indeed themselves. And more importantly, they understand that young people are being exposed to this like never before. And the consequences on the younger generation of this are now starting to become more apparent. And parents in particular are very concerned about that, but so are others. And I think, apart from anything else, the links with family violence, the links with crime of all sorts, the links with physical and mental ill health, they're starting to become better researched and better understood. And making that much more publicly available, even though it's difficult, is something that governments have to act on. I mean, they had to act against their better judgment when the links between tobacco and cancer were demonstrated to be so clear. And I think what we have to do is generate better evidence about the links between gambling and suicide, gambling and family violence, gambling and crime, gambling and family breakdown, etc. And my sense is that process has begun, that it will accelerate, and that we will see effective regulation much sooner than we might otherwise think.
Ați ascultat Algoritmi și adicție, un podcast despre fenomenul jocurilor de noroc în România. De-a lungul celor 8 episoade ale podcastului am discutat despre natura socială, politică și culturală a fenomenului jocurilor de noroc atât în România cât și la nivel global. Am aflat ce este dependența de jocuri de noroc, cum se manifestă aceasta și ce opțiuni de tratament există pentru persoanele afectate de dependență. Am analizat discursul industriei despre sine, cum comunică prin intermediul publicității, a influencerilor și a interminabilelor campanii de activare de brand. Am investigat impactul pe care industria îl are asupra minorilor și tinerilor din România. Am examinat motivele pentru care presa ar trebui să fie independentă de influențele acestei industrii și am cercetat motivele pentru care conceptul de joc responsabil este doar o perdea de fum pe care industria o folosește pentru a evita să-și asume responsabilitatea pentru produsele nocive pe care le vinde.
Ce putem face pe viitor? În primul rând, trebuie să continuăm să vorbim despre acest subiect, prin analize de discurs, cercetări științifice, anchete sociologice, studii antropologice și o multitudine de proiecte culturale și artistice, până când acumulăm suficientă cunoaștere despre subiect pentru a putea combate discursul industriei cu argumente solide.
Apoi, trebuie să schimbăm discuția din jurul fenomenului dependenței. Conceptul de joc responsabil este doar o tehnică a industriei de a muta responsabilitatea pe umerii jucătorilor, argumentând că jocurile de noroc sunt doar o altă activitate economică ca oricare alta, ignorând faptul că acestea provoacă dependență în aceeași măsură ca alcoolul, tutunul și drogurile. De aceea, trebuie să cerem industriei să se supună acelorași standarde de siguranță și calitate a produselor și serviciilor la care se supun toate celelalte industrii.
Mai mult, trebuie să cerem statului să utilizeze sumele strânse din taxarea industriei de jocuri de noroc pentru dezvoltarea unui sistem solid și predictibil de tratament a dependenței, pentru derularea unor programe bine gândite de prevenție, ce vizează în primul rând minorii, și pentru subvenționarea unor programe de pregătire a specialiștilor, medici, psihologi, asistenți sociali de diverse specialități, în domeniul medicina adicției.
Nu în cele din urmă, trebuie să încercăm să analizăm care sunt costurile sociale ale acestui fenomen și ce impact va avea asupra întregii populații în anii ce vor urma. Așa cum specifica și raportul The Lancet Public Health Commission on Gambling, citez, jocurile de noroc sunt asociate cu o serie de efecte dăunătoare pentru indivizi, familii, comunități și societăți. Jocurile de noroc cresc riscul de suicid și violență domestică și sunt asociate cu sărăcia financiară și ruptura familială. Jocurile de noroc pot avea consecințe negative pentru indivizi și familiile acestora care se pot întinde pe generații.
Proiectul Algoritmi și adicție este o cercetare multimedia interdisciplinară despre jocurile de noroc online și impactul acestui fenomen asupra societății românești, cofinanțat de Administrația Fondului Cultural Național. Toate materialele cercetării pot fi accesate online pe adresa www.cinefocus.ro, precum și pe toate platformele digitale ale proiectului. Proiectul nu reprezintă în mod necesar poziția Administrației Fondului Cultural Național. AFCN nu este responsabilă de conținutul proiectului sau de modul în care rezultatele proiectului pot fi folosite. Acestea sunt în întregime responsabilitatea beneficiarului finanțării. Pe curând!